29. The mayor closed his front door behind them and moved into the room at the front of the house to watch them through the window. The two men crunched across the gravel drive, climbed into their car, and drove away in full conversation. He had no doubt they were discussing him and his answers to their questions. He imagined them talking about his house and how impressed they were by him, his clothes, his surroundings. He wondered if his answers were what they had been expecting, if they had learned anything new from him. He wondered exactly what it was they were trying to discover, as he had nothing to hide, and neither did any of his guests. When they had disappeared from his view, he walked back to the room he had entered earlier for paper. It was a large study, with an imposing desk sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by shelves stacked with old volumes and books. As he passed it, he replaced the pen pad in its place on the desk. On the same wall as the wall that the desk faced, was a mirror. It was large enough to allow a full reflection of the head, shoulders, and most of the torso. He stood in front of it, watching himself for a few minutes, searching his eyes. He looked at himself amongst the books, the fine surroundings. He tilted his head this way and that as if listening for something. Eventually he stopped and walked through the house down a sprawl of corridors to the back garden. He let himself out and walked for a minute or two to a quiet spot at the back of the grounds looking out to the copse. He stopped, apparently not feeling the cold biting or the wind splatter of rain that began soaking his fine clothes. He stood quite still, tilted his head, and listened to the whispering of the trees. Chapter 30. "Well, what did you make of him, Drew?" the inspector asked when they had buckled their seat belts. The car spluttered into life and Drew pulled away once more into the cold day. A mist of spit filled the air, and windscreen wipers screeched across their view of the road. I don't think he was too pleased at being questioned like that, but he sounded genuine enough. "Are you still going to check the other guests?" Drew began to move the car away from the house. "Yes, I think we'd better. There's something about the story I don't like. These men are all from very different walks of life. The doctor, two policemen, a pub landlord and the mayor. Even if they were friends at school, why should they still meet up regularly like that?" The inspector thought for a moment and wondered if they were even aware they were hiding something. He removed the list of guests from his pocket and studied it for a moment before comparing it to the list Banks had given him. "All in the same order," he commented to Drew. "How odd." He thought for a moment. "Drew, out of those who attended the mayor's that night, who would you say was, well, the slowest? Perhaps someone whom might be more open to asking questions the mayor would not have liked." Drew smiled at the inspector's method. "It would be Atkins, the constable," he replied knowingly. "Perhaps we should start with him. Lead the way, young Drew." Knowing which direction he now needed to head, he picked up speed and took them back down the lanes towards the house of Constable Atkins. The quickest way back to town took them towards the small parade of shops, and as they approached, Drew noticed a figure walking to his car. "That's Dr. Sparrow." He pointed him out to the inspector. "Well, what a stroke of luck. Shall we stop and have a quick chat?" the inspector suggested. Drew obliged and pulled the car up at the next space he saw, on the opposite side of the road. The two men were quickly out and had caught up to the doctor before he had a chance to get in his car. "Dr. Sparrow," Drew called to him as they approached. He turned to face them, car keys in hand, and was surprised to see an officer of the law approaching. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Of all the men on the list, the doctor looked the youngest. He was dressed in casual blue slacks, a light beige coat, and had hair of a longer, more fashionable length. "Hello, Doctor. I'm Constable Gates from Firestone Copse. This is an inspector from Scotland Yard. We were wondering if we could have a quick word." My, yes, this sounds serious. The doctor was relaxed, comfortable in the knowledge that he was an innocent man and that their search was not for him. "Thank you so much," the inspector thanked him. "Could you tell us where you were on Sunday night, between the hours of, say, 9 o'clock at night and 1 a.m? "Yes, of course. I spent the evening at the mayor's house with some friends. I left them at around 11 and went straight home." He was happy to tell them everything. He yielded to questioning obediently. "I see. And what did you do at the mayor's house?" the inspector asked. "Oh, we drank port, played cards, reminisced about our school days together," the doctor replied airily. "And who else was there?" the inspector asked, taking out his notebook. "Well, there was Sergeant Banks, myself, your colleague Atkins, and Charlie." "I see, thank you." The inspector passed the doctor his notebook. "Would you mind writing them all down for me?" The doctor placed his case down on the pavement. "No, of course not," he replied, casually taking the book from him and writing down the names in a messy hand. He passed the inspector back his notebook with a smile. "Thank you so much for your time, Doctor." "No problem. Is there anything I should know? Is one of my friends in some kind of trouble?" "Not at all. We are simply following up a few lines of inquiry, following the discovery of the body on Sunday night, eliminating people from our inquiries." "I see. Yes, I heard about that. My patients have been talking about it all day. Anything I can help with?" the doctor offered kindly. "Oh, that is a thoughtful offer, but we have everything in hand. Thank you so much for your time. Please don't allow us to hold you up any longer." The inspector tucked his notebook safely back into his coat pocket. "No problem. I have a few more house calls to make, but I'll be back for this afternoon surgery about 3. He opened his car door. "Should you need me for anything else," he added, before climbing in. "Yes, I will bear that in mind. Good day." The inspector raised his hat and Dr. Sparrow drove off to his next appointment. Drew and the inspector watched him drive away before returning to their car. "The same story again," Drew pointed out, "almost to the word." He fired up the engine and rubbed his hands together for warmth. "Yes, and the same list in the same order," the inspector compared the 3 lists. "Let us see what Constable Atkins can reveal, shall we?" Drew obliged, and they continued on their way. Chapter 31. Dr. Sparrow drove his car away from the policeman and towards his next appointment. He wondered why they were interested in his movements on Sunday night, and then wondered if it wasn't his movements, but the movements of another of the mayor's guests. Without noticing, he drove past the turning that would have taken him to Mrs. Smythe, his next appointment. Instead, he continued away from the houses and into the copse. He pulled his car up along a quiet lane and, without consciously realizing that he was doing it, climbed out of his car. He walked a few yards into the copse until he was out of sight, surrounded by trees, and he began to listen to the branches swaying in the wind. On the road where he had parked his car, a figure watched him, hidden between the trunks. Chapter 32. Atkins lived in a small 2-up, 2-down house on an estate near the old train station. Originally built for the men working on the railway, they were cheaply made and cheaply maintained. There were 2 streets of these houses, all identical. Their occupants were largely those who lived alone, without the income nor the need for anything larger. The inspector knocked on the thin wooden door, and immediately the 2 men heard an outburst of barking, followed by the gruff sound of a man shouting at the creature responsible to shut up. After a few moments' struggle to put the dog somewhere safe, the front doors opened a crack and a face appeared. "All right, Drew, what's up?" Atkins asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. He wasn't used to uniformed officers visiting him at his door. "Hello, Jerry. This is the inspector down from the yard. He wants to ask you a few questions if you're not busy." "Oh," Atkins paused. "No, of course not. Hang on." The door closed again briefly while the chain was removed, and then it was fully opened. "You'd better come in then. It's too bloody cold to be standing around with the door open today." He led them into the house. The front door opened directly from the pavement onto the front room. No grand hallway separated the inside from the outside. "Shall I get the kettle on? Think you'll be here long enough for a cuppa?" "Oh, I believe there's always time for a cup of tea," the inspector replied as he crossed the threshold. The room they entered contained a small settee, a smaller chair, and a television with a football match being played on its grainy black and white screen. A flight of stairs led directly off it, leading, the inspector resumed, up to a small bedroom and bathroom. "Right you are, back in a tick. Have a seat." Atkins left through the only door out of the room, struggling as the dog contained within tried to escape. It whimpered and gave a few barks, and Atkins replied in kind with swearing and threats. "I don't mind if the dog wants to come in," the inspector called from his seat as Atkins wrestled his way through the door to the kitchen. "Are you sure?" Atkins called back. "She can be a bit of a pain." "No, of course, please. It will be easier for you, and more pleasant for her, I'm sure." With permission granted, Atkins gave up his fight, and a large Alsatian bounded excitedly out of the kitchen and up to the 2 men, who made themselves comfortable on the small and rather worn-out settee. The dog was friendly, displaying her affection by attempting to lick both men's faces simultaneously, jumping around in circles and giving small excited barks at them. The inspector stroked her head and back, making calm shh noises. She immediately took a liking to him, sitting at his feet and staring at him expectantly. He studied her name tag. There, Cara," he told her, using a tone soothing enough to calm the storm. There, shh. Cara soon calmed and made herself comfortable at his feet, enjoying the attention. Atkins appeared presently with 3 chipped and dirty cups full of tea. He struggled out of the kitchen with them, holding 2 awkwardly in one hand by the handles. "Well, who's a little hussy then?" he asked Cara, who looked up at him indifferently. "Here you go, lads, a nice hot brew." He dished out the cups and they sat sipping the tea and watching the game. "Did I miss anything?" Atkins asked. "No, though United need this game to stay up, don't they?" Drew replied. "They also need Newcastle to lose. Not much chance of that when they're playing at home, though." The inspector sipped his tea. "I'm very sorry to interrupt such an important game," he apologised sympathetically, "but I do need to ask you a few questions." "Yes, of course." Atkins' eyes did not turn away from the screen. "Where were you on Sunday night, between the hours of 9 in the evening and 1 in the morning?" Atkins thought for a moment, retracing his steps. "Sunday? I was having dinner with the mayor and a few old friends up at his house," he replied rather proudly. "Sounds nice," the inspector replied. "Who else was there?" "Banks, Dr. Sparrow, me and Charlie." "Well, seems like an eclectic collection of friends. How do you all know each other?" the inspector asked. "We were all at school together. We all sort of stayed in touch over the years. A lot of people from Firestone move away as soon as they're old enough. Not much here to keep them around. We all stayed, so we all meet up about once a month. I see. And what made you stay here, if so many of your friends moved? Well, my old mum, she was very ill and needed me to stay. Then I got the constable's job, which I really liked, so I stayed here. And when you go to the mayor's house, what do? We play cards, drink port, reminisce about our school days, people we knew. And you meet up on a Sunday. Didn't you all have work the next day? Yes, but it's not always easy to find a day when we're all free, especially the mayor. The inspector sipped his tea. Well, I think it's wonderful that you have all stayed in contact for so long. I can't say the same for anyone I went to school with. Small town like this, it's hard not to stay in touch, Atkins pointed out. Everyone knows everyone else's business anyway. The inspector stroked Cora's back. Atkins stared, hypnotised at the television. Drew and the inspector exchanged looks. And what of the mayor and Banks? What's their relationship like? The inspector asked. It's fine, I suppose, Atkins replied. They're the most well-off of us all. Bloody rolling in it, the mayor is. You should see his house. Banks ain't doing too badly for himself either, I reckon. What makes you say that? The inspector asked. Well, it's like a competition with him and the mayor, you know. Who's got what, or how many of those. He makes a fortune from renting the farm out, I know that much. The inspector raised an eyebrow in interest. Rents? I was led to believe he had sold it, he asked. Oh, no, he still owns it. Just rents out the land and the new house to the bloke up there. What's his name? Colin Underwood, Drew replied. Yeah, that's him. Atkins took a mouthful of tea. Ooh, bloody hell, come on, United, he suddenly shouted as his team missed a goal. The inspector and Drew had drained their cups. Well, thanks for the tea, but I feel we must be off, the inspector informed him. You're welcome to stay and watch the match if you like, gents. There was a hint of loneliness in his voice, as if the company was appreciated, even if it was on an official level. Well, that is a very kind offer, but we must be getting on. Hope the game turns out in your favour. They stood to leave, and Cara immediately began pacing the room, whining after them. The inspector patted her on the head. Right you are, see you then. Atkins opened the door for them, and they stepped back out into the chilly afternoon. Well, he was a nice chap, the inspector noted as they walked back to the squad car in the cold afternoon light. Hard to see him still being friends with the Banks after all this time, though, seeing as none of his other mates are. No, I suppose not, Drew replied, and opened the car. Next on the list is Charlie, who should be at the Black Prince. We passed the station on the way. Shall we head in and see if Banks has appeared? I think we will leave Charlie for now. We can drop into the station before stopping for a spot of lunch. I'm eager to see how Dr. Ward is progressing, so then we'll head to Nettlewood. Drew nodded in understanding and drove them back to the police station. They entered to find the front desk unmanned. Drew rang the bell, but no one came to answer, so he leant into the open reception desk window and removed the key from a hook on the wall. He unlocked the door and let the inspector in. In the staff room they found the desk sergeant eating his sandwiches and reading a paper. Did you hear us ringing, Sergeant? The inspector asked indignantly. Well, yes, I was just getting up when I heard you let yourselves in, he replied defensively through a mouthful of ham and cheese sandwich. We could have been anybody, Drew pointed out. You weren't though, were you? He mumbled, shrugging off the young constable's approach. Any sign of Banks? Drew asked. The inspector was noticing Drew taking a more confident tone with him and did nothing to stop it. No one's been in here since you left, he replied, standing defensively. Neither man backed down. The inspector sniffed the air. I think Banks might have been in, he pointed out. No, I didn't see him, the desk sergeant replied. They walked away from him, leaving him bruised and bewildered, and made their way up the corridor towards Banks's office. The inspector checked to see if the door was open, but was disappointed, so picked the lock again. This time Drew followed him in. Can you smell the cigarette smoke? The inspector asked rhetorically. The odour filled the air. Never saw the appeal myself, Drew replied. The inspector studied the desk and cabinets. These papers have been moved. He has been here, and he wants us to know he's been here, the inspector surmised. Why would he do that? Drew asked. As an alibi, as a game, the inspector checked the files on the desk. No changes had been made recently. The crime detailed on them merely served as a prop in Banks's game. Come, Drew. I feel I need some food. Let's get up to the Green Man again. The inspector paused at the staff room and the desk sergeant with a mouthful of fresh sandwich. Should Banks come back to the station, please inform him that I am looking for him, and that he should contact me in Drew's car immediately. Do you understand? The inspector's tone was severe. The man looked at the inspector in fear, suddenly conscious that he may have more power than he bargained for. Yes, Inspector, he replied timidly. I want the desk manned every minute that the station is opened. I don't mind if you eat your sandwiches while you are there. However, I am sure that you have better things to do than read your book. The man swallowed a lump of fear that had lodged in his throat. And I want a list of everyone that comes through that door, the time they came in, the time they go out, and what they want in this building. Do you understand? Drew was pleased to hear the inspector taking the man to task. It had been a long time coming. Yes, Inspector, the constable repeated, picking up his lunch-box and immediately heading out to the front desk. The inspector glared at him displeasingly, and he squirmed under his powerful eyes. When he had returned to his desk, the inspector considered the station disapprovingly. This place is not up to scratch, he informed him thoughtfully. I want at least 2 officers here at all time. I want you to find the location of all the other officers and get some of them to come in to help you cover, the inspector told him firmly. The man nodded obediently. How am I supposed to find them? He asked the inspector timidly. You're a police officer. I'm sure you will work something out, the inspector informed him. He turned to Drew with a nod, and they disappeared outside, leaving the desk constable scratching his head. Drew, to the Green Man, if you pleased, he asked the younger constable nicely, and they headed for the car. Chapter 33. Drew found a convenient space to park a short walk away from the pub, and they hurried along in the dreary afternoon to the warmth of the saloon bar. The inspector went in first, and as had happened on the previous day, the conversation trailed off when the patrons realised who was coming in. The inspector pretended not to notice and headed for the bar. Pint of bitter, Drew? The inspector asked. No, not while I'm on duty, Inspector. I'll join you in a pot of tea, though, Drew suggested jovially. Very good, the inspector replied, and waited patiently for service. Presently Lionel appeared from the kitchen. Oh, hello again, Inspector. Drew. He welcomed them to his establishment with the grin of a man who knew he was about to become a little better off. Hello, Lionel. Any change to the menu, or can we just have the same as we had yesterday? The inspector asked. Of course. Take your seats, gents, and Mavis will bring you some soup over shortly, he told them gleefully. That's great. Also, while I have your attention, I noticed your vacancy sign outside, and was hoping I might be able to book a room with you. Lionel's smile grew a little at the corners. Of course, Inspector. We have all the rooms free at the moment, so you can take your pick. Do you have a room with an ensuite? Yes, no problem. And could I possibly have a key to the front door so as not to disturb you too much should my investigations run into the small hours? Yes, I think we have a spare somewhere, Lionel replied, eyeing an unseen board of keys hidden behind the bar. Wonderful. Well, perhaps after lunch I can move my things in. Of course, sir, not a problem. They retired to their table with their steaming pot. Presently Mavis appeared with a beaming smile and started fussing over them. The food she delivered seemed to have only improved overnight, and the 2 men ate their lunches eagerly. It had been a busy morning. As they ate, the mood in the bar lightened. The locals were becoming more accustomed to the sight of the inspector and Drew in their establishment, not to mention the admiration of his appetite. The news of the inspector's change of location caused their tongues to wag a little more ferociously, and, the inspector hoped, would make them a little more likely to approach him with any information they may have. When they had finished their meal, Mavis came and began clearing away their plates. The 2 men sat drinking the remainder of their tea and relaxed for a few moments. Another impressive spread, the inspector noted, rubbing his belly appreciatively. He took a large gulp from his cup. Washed down with a cup of tea. The perfect way to prepare for the afternoon ahead. He stood and approached the bar. Lionel spotted him coming and immediately jumped to his feet. Everything all right, Inspector? He asked. Yes, again, a most excellent spread, thank you. Our pleasure, Lionel replied happily. Well, we're all finished. Perhaps if I'm staying I could start a tab and add today's bill to it. Of course. Hold on, I'll tally it all up now and get you started. Lionel began punching numbers into the till, and when it was all done he opened the guest book and added the receipt to it. Here you are then, Inspector. If I could get you to add your details here. Lionel passed him the book, and the inspector dutifully filled out his details. Many thanks. Now, would you like to see your room? Yes, shall we get the cases from the car first? He asked Drew from across the room, heads turned and voices lowered. Can do, Drew replied, enjoying the theatrics of the scene. Perhaps you could give us a hand, Lionel. They're a bit heavy. Yes, of course. I'll just get Mavis to come and watch the bar, Lionel replied begrudgingly. He glanced around as if looking for an excuse not to leave his beloved pub, but when nothing appeared he went into the kitchen in search of his wife, returning with her a few moments later. So here you'll be staying with us a while, Inspector, she asked, doing little to hide her pleasure at the news. Indeed, Mavis, your good husband here was just about to help me in with my cases, if we may borrow him for a few minutes. Certainly. Don't let me hold you up. Be good to see him doing a bit of work for a change, she added with a smile. Oi, watch it, cheeky, Lionel laughed, leaving the bar and its tittering occupants. He followed Drew and the inspector outside and along the road. Before taking the cases, the inspector removed from them a few items he would need for the rest of the day's activities, namely his Wellingtons and a pair of waterproof trousers. He stowed these in the boot next to Drew's Wellingtons. Drew then struggled with the heavier of the 2 cases, leaving Lionel and the inspector to carry the others. Soon they were back in from the cold, and they made their way through the bar and upstairs. The rest of the pub was decorated in a similar manner to the main bar area, a little out of date but with a friendly, homely feel. The corridor upstairs had shadowy corners, a red carpet shirked beneath their feet, cream walls skulked in the background. Here we go, Lionel said, opening the door. Room 6 was warm and comfortable. The bathroom was smaller than that at the Swan and Dove, but it had all the inspector required. He went through the same routine as he had in the previous accommodation, of closing the door and testing the light. He emerged quite satisfied. Yes, this will do fine, he told Lionel. Thanks so much for putting me up at such short notice. He thanked the landlord gratefully. You're very welcome, Inspector, he replied. Shall we leave you to unpack? No time for that now, I'm afraid. We must be off to Nettlewood Hospital. Very well. Would you like to book a table this evening for dinner? Lionel asked. Capital idea. I'll take a table at 7. As you wish, the one by the window. That would be perfect. The men descended the stairs, the inspector locking the door behind him. Well, see you this evening then, Inspector, Lionel called after them as he took his place again behind the bar. Indeed, good day, the inspector called back, and they made their way out into the cold. As soon as the door was closed behind them, the bar erupted into heated discussion. Chapter 34. Banks left the station and began the drive back to his house, but already knew he wouldn't find them there. He spat and swore aloud in the car, staring at his own front door. The inspector would have turned her against him, or would have tried. He didn't want to go inside just yet. He sensed that his wife had been instructed to telephone the police as soon as she saw him. He concentrated for a moment, using the trees and the power within to locate the inspector. He felt him in the town, nearby, and tore himself away from the house. He drove toward the centre of town and found them outside the Green Man, struggling with the inspector's cases. Banks stopped a safe distance away. He gawped at the luggage, and he turned into a rage. He screamed and swore at them, in complete shock that he had come to stay in Firestone. He took a deep breath, opening the window to get some air. The trees blew quietly in the breeze around him, and suddenly he sat up and looked out. In a state of panic, he started the car and sped off to a quiet spot he knew in the trees. He parked his car where he thought it couldn't be seen, then walked a few paces into the foliage. He came to a clearing, quiet and peaceful, where he stopped and listened intently to the whispers in the trees. Chapter 35. Has he seen us all? Does he know us all? No, he has not found me yet. He asked about you. Yes, he asked about you. It doesn't matter. He isn't interested in me. Then who is he interested in? The one that stops us all. The one that blocks the escape. He came back. He must know something. So we will be freed. No, we cannot leave. We must stay. The new voice again, silencing the rest, spreading fear they tried to hide. This voice had changed a long time ago. It was no longer like theirs. This could be our only chance. We have to stay. Hide in town. We must protect it. Hide it. The voices drifted away at this intrusion. The trees swayed and buckled under the wind, each branch shimmering. The voices listened, waiting for each other, wondering if they were alone or if the other was still listening. We should meet without him, in secret, the Black Prince tonight. Yes, the Black Prince. Chapter 36. When Drew and the inspector reached the hospital, they left the car in the small car park at the front and walked across the patchwork of puddles to the main building. From the front, the hospital gave the misleading appearance of being quite small. The original building had been converted from a mansion house with red brick and a high tiled roof. Time had now decorated its exterior with sprouts of moss. Hidden behind the grandness of the mansion stood the main building of the hospital, a modern construction of bland grey concrete and windows. The buildings, old and new, were set in a landscape of trees and fields, with gardens set aside here and there for patients to sit in and aid their convalescence. They entered the grand hall of the older building and approached the unmanned reception desk. The inspector pinged the bell on the desk to alert the staff to their arrival. Presently, a matron appeared, as tall as she was round, with an officious face and a frightful demeanour. She looked the two men up and down as if she wanted them out of her hospital. She could tell they were trouble. Good afternoon. We're here for Dr. Collins. I believe a colleague of mine is here already. I'm an inspector from Scotland Yard. The inspector cut through her dissection of him with a polite rise of his hat. This way, she replied through tightly clenched teeth, giving them the impression she knew exactly who they were and what she needed to do with them. The inspector was more impressed with her than she was with him. She dashed off at speed, and they were shown briskly through a winding maze of identical hospital corridors, all white tiles and whited-out windows. Eventually she delivered them to the door of the morgue and knocked twice. After a few minutes the bald little shape of Dr. Collins answered it. "Hello, Nurse McCall, what brings you to my door?" he asked her rather warily. "This gentleman is from London. He's here to see the doctor that you have in there from London." "Yes, about a man from Swindon, I believe. Come in, Inspector. Casey's just through here." "Thank you so much for your help," the inspector called to Nurse McCall's back as she hurried off to more important things. They entered the cold white morgue and followed Dr. Collins in at a much more comfortable pace. This ward was much like the other wards in the hospital that they had just raced through, but was much quieter. "I trust you chaps are well. How goes the investigation today?" "Very well, thank you, Doctor. How goes the dissection?" "You'll have to speak to Casey about that. She hasn't really let me be much help," he replied, hiding his disappointment. They pushed through a set of double doors and into the colder section of the morgue. "All I have really done is fetch her lunch." "Well, I'm sure she's appreciated being left to do her job." The inspector tried to put the doctor's mind at ease. "Yes, well, I'm happy to let her get on with it. Shall I put the kettle on for you? 3 teas, Dr. Collins asked. "That would be capital, thank you, Doctor," the inspector replied gratefully. Right you are, she's just through there. He waved towards another set of double doors for them before scuttling away to prepare their tea. They followed his direction and pushed the double doors open to find Casey in the operating room with a naked dead man spread out on a stainless steel table in front of her. She had on a tray to her right a collection of hair cuttings and skin scrapings chosen for further inspection. On a tray to her left was a collection of medieval-looking tools, all stained red with their part in the dissection of the man's remains. "Casey, how good to see you again. How are things going?" Casey removed the mask over her mouth and the green surgical hat. "Ah, Inspector, I should have expected a body like this from you." She smiled at him as one might welcome an old friend. Drew approached the cadaver, recognising it from the hole through the centre of the chest. Spread on a table in this manner, he was no longer a person but a piece of evidence, to be cut away at and scrutinised. He gulped nervously at the body. "Afternoon, Drew. Hope he's not working you too hard." Casey had about her an indifference of being a woman in what was traditionally a man's workplace. Drew did his best to hide how impressed he was with her. "He's doing a good job of keeping me busy," he replied simply. "Yes, he has a habit of doing that." Her mouth edged up at the sides into a pixie-like smile. The inspector chuckled, amused at being discussed as though he wasn't there. Dr. Collins then entered, carrying a tray and 4 mugs. "Ah, thank you, Alan." Casey moved away from the body, covering it with a green cloth. They took their mugs and stood sipping the hot tea for a moment. "So I suppose Nettlewood is a bit of a change of pace to what you're used to in the city, Inspector?" Dr. Collins asked. "Actually, I spend a lot of my time travelling the country, investigating various cases," he explained. This surprised Drew, who'd always just presumed the inspector worked mainly in London. Nettlewood and Firestone aren't that dissimilar to a lot of rural towns, though each is of course different in their own way. The room fell silent for a moment, and Alan seemed to notice they had stopped talking when he had entered the room. "Well, if you'll excuse me." Dr. Collins raised his mug to them and strolled purposefully back to his desk politely. Casey waited for a moment. When it became clear to her that the inspector would not be asking Drew to leave with the doctor, she gave a pleased smile. "Well then, Drew, Inspector, let's think about this poor chap," Casey continued as soon as he was gone. "Time of death I would estimate to be at about 1:30 Sunday night, judging by the rate of rigor mortis." "About the time you discovered him, Drew," the inspector pointed out. Drew nodded with a shiver. "He was a non-smoker, I would say 32 years of age," Casey continued. "No distinguishable features, no tattoos, no wedding ring. In fact, there is nothing odd about this gentleman, apart from the 2 things that you are here to determine, Inspector, the 2 things that I will be totally unable to help you with, namely, how this chap came to be where he was, and what caused that hole to appear in his chest." The inspector ruffled his moustache with his hand in thought. "There are no bruises or markings to suggest he was involved in any type of struggle. If he had been dragged or carried, we would see bruising or scratching on the body where it was dragged. However, he is clear of any injuries, apart from the obvious. Not even a razor cut. His clothes are clean, recently washed, perhaps even clean on the morning he was killed. I have taken some cuttings of his hair and some swabs inside his mouth and of his armpits. They are currently sitting in test tubes in the other room, awaiting results. Hopefully we should have something in another 8 hours or so." She motioned out to the other room with a wave of her hand. "Now for the good bit," she told them with a smile. "Typically of your cases, and the reason I thought it best that the good doctor left the room, there are some odd things about this corpse." She lifted up an evidence bag and handed it to the inspector. It looked empty. Drew exchanged a look with the inspector at the empty bag. "Look closer," she advised. The inspector held it up to the light, and the 2 men were just able to discern 2 barely visible tiny plastic discs with curved edges like shallow, miniature, transparent bowls. The inspector studied them closely. "Fascinating." "Aren't they?" she agreed. They all peered at the bag, trying to fathom them. "I found them on his eyes," Casey informed them. "On his eyes?" Drew asked, astonished. "Like miniature lenses?" he suggested. Casey suddenly screamed. "Of course!" she laughed. "It seems so obvious now, but I couldn't work it out for the life of me." Drew blushed a little at her reaction. "Yes, good spot, Drew. Well done," the inspector informed him with a little more restraint. "Let's move on to the cause of death." Casey pulled the green sheet off the body again. "It is, I would hope, fairly obvious to you what has caused this person to die. However, the wound itself is rather odd." She passed the inspector a magnifying glass and he leant down to examine the wound with it. "You'll notice there are no exit or entry marks on the skin. Usually there would be some kind of dragging or tearing of the skin." She looked away from the wound to Drew. "As a cutting instrument like a knife or a saw enters the body, it stretches and drags the skin." She mimicked a saw cutting through her arm. "Even the sharpest of blades leave their mark behind. We can use it to work out what kind of weapon made the cut." Drew nodded, turning his attention back to the hole in the poor man's chest. "But this skin is intact," Casey continued quietly. Her subtle tones echoed about the room. "It was not cut. It's as though the skin next to it was unhooked, and the 2 parts were gently separated. This pattern is copied as you follow the wound through the body, through bone, organ, muscle, all in the same pattern. No cut marks, no dragging or tearing. The bones haven't even cracked or splintered." The inspector looked up at Casey, rather mystified. Any ideas what might have caused it? She asked him. I've never seen anything like it, have you? The inspector stood up straight and passed her back the magnifying glass. No, sorry, never seen anything like it, he informed her. Casey wondered if this was the truth, but didn't press him any further. I have a lot more work to do before I'm any closer to working that out, he added. Yes, and I will need more time to see if there's anything else I can find out about him, she informed him, finishing her tea and placing her mug on a rare patch of empty work surface. The inspector took the hint. Very well, we'll leave you to it and pop by tomorrow. Drew and the inspector bid the two doctors goodbye and made their way back along the corridors of the hospital and out into the cold air. Drew would have easily become lost along the maze of identical repetitive white-tiled walls and floors, but the inspector led them quietly back to the entrance as if he had walked the path all his life. They returned to the car without seeing the severe matron on reception. Now, what's next? The inspector asked out loud, fishing out his notebook and skipping through a few pages. Oh yes, let's return to the scene, see if we can pick anything else up on that camera of yours, the inspector suggested. If we must, though I must admit I'm not looking forward to it, Drew confided. No, neither am I, the inspector replied honestly. Well, we'll try and get it over with as quickly as possible, he assured him.